Around 1200 BC, one of the most powerful states the world had ever known simply stopped writing. For roughly 4 centuries, the Hittites had ruled a mountain kingdom in the heart of what is now Turkey, negotiating as equals with Egypt, commanding Bronze Age armies, in a world where iron was still rare and holding together dozens of peoples across a rugged plateau. Then the clay tablets go quiet. The capital burns, the royal line vanishes from the record, and within a generation or two, the empire that had once forced the pharaoh of Egypt to sign the earliest surviving peace treaty in human history was so thoroughly gone that later civilizations barely remembered it existed at all. Here is the strange part. The Hittites were not conquered in a single great battle we can point to. There is no famous last stand, no named invader who marched into the throne room, no clean ending. A state that had survived plagues, civil wars, rebellions, and the ambitions of every neighbor for hundreds of years came apart, so quietly that for most of recorded history, nobody even knew the name Hatti. The Bible mentioned Hittites, but as a minor local people, not a superpower. It took 19th and 20th century archaeology and the decoding of a lost language to prove that an empire had once stood here at all. So how does a great power disappear without an obvious killer? What actually breaks when a Bronze Age empire breaks? And why did the Hittites, of all the powers of their age, leave so faint a shadow that the world forgot them for 3,000 years? Those are the questions worth sitting with, because the answer is not a story of one enemy or one disaster. It is the story of a system, an intricate machine of grain, water, vassals, chariots, and letters that worked brilliantly under good conditions and had almost no ability to absorb bad ones. To understand why the Hittites fell, you first have to understand how unlikely it was that they ever rose. By the end of this, you should be able to see the collapse not as a mystery with a single missing clue, but as a structure that was quietly running out of the things it needed to stand. Let us begin where the Hittites did, in a place that should never have produced an empire at all. The center of the Hittite world was the Anatolian plateau, the high interior of modern Turkey. If you were designing a homeland for a great power, you would not choose this. The plateau is a land of long, cold winters and dry, hot summers, ringed and cut by mountains, with rivers that are often too seasonal or too gorge, bound to serve as easy highways. Compare this to the other great civilizations of the age. Egypt had the Nile, a river so reliable it turned a desert into the richest farmland on earth, and delivered a predictable flood almost every year. Mesopotamia had the Tigris and Euphrates, 2 great rivers feeding a flat plain of irrigated fields. Those civilizations were built on water that arrived on a schedule. The Hittite heartland had no such gift. Farming on the plateau depended heavily on rainfall, and rainfall in this part of the world is not generous and not consistent. A good year could fill the granaries. A bad year could empty them. 2 or 3 bad years in a row could threaten the survival of the state itself. This single fact, that the Hittite food supply rested on an unpredictable sky rather than a dependable river, sits underneath the entire story of their rise and their fall. Remember it. It will return at the end like a debt coming due. So why build a power here at all? Because the plateau, for all its hardship, sat at a crossroads. Anatolia is a land bridge. It connects Europe to the Near East, the Aegean coast to the Mesopotamian plains, the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled the passes and the highlands controlled the movement of goods and people through one of the ancient world's great intersections. And the mountains that made farming hard also made the region rich in something the Bronze Age craved. Metal, Anatolia had ores. It had timber. It had silver, which functioned as money across the whole eastern Mediterranean. The land that punished farmers rewarded traders and miners. There was also a defensive logic to the highlands. The same terrain that made life difficult made invasion difficult too. Armies that wanted to conquer the plateau had to climb into it, stretch their supply lines across hard country, and fight an enemy who knew every gorge and ridge. The Hittite core was, in a sense, a natural fortress. This is the first of the empire's deep contradictions, the pattern we will see again and again. The very features that gave the Hittites strength also planted the seeds of their fragility. The plateau protected them and starved them at the same time. Now, who were the people who came to rule this land? Here we have to be careful, because the evidence is partial and some of it is debated. The Hittites called their kingdom the land of Hatti, but that name was actually borrowed. Before the people we call Hittites arrived, an earlier population lived in central Anatolia, whom modern scholars call the Hattians. They had their own language, their own gods, their own towns. The newcomers, who spoke an Indo-European language, one distantly related to Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and ultimately English, moved into this region, most likely over a long period, rather than in one dramatic invasion, and gradually fused with the people already there. This matters more than it might seem. From the very beginning, the Hittites were not a single pure people imposing themselves on a blank land. They were a blend. They took the name of the land from its earlier inhabitants. They absorbed Hattian gods into their own pantheon. Later, they would borrow writing from Mesopotamia, religious ideas from Syria, and administrative habits from everyone they met. The Hittite genius, if we can call it that, was never really conquest for its own sake. It was absorption, adaptation, the stitching together of different peoples into one working system. That skill would build the empire. It would also mean that the empire was always a patchwork, held together by arrangements rather than by any deep, shared identity, and a patchwork can come apart along its seams. The rise itself began, as far as our evidence allows us to say, with the gathering of scattered Anatolian towns under stronger rulers. In the early 2nd millennium BC, central Anatolia was a landscape of small city-states and trading centers, some of them dotted with the outposts of Assyrian merchants who came from Mesopotamia to buy metal and sell textiles and tin. Those merchant records, written on clay, are actually one of our best early windows into the region, and they show us a world of commerce running long before any Hittite Empire existed. Power in this early period was local and fragmented, exactly the condition a would-be empire has to overcome. The breakthrough came when ambitious rulers began to knit these towns together. First by force, then by organization. Tradition, preserved in later Hittite texts, credits early kings with expanding outward from a core and eventually establishing a capital at a site, the Hittites, called Hattusa, high in a defensible bend of the northern plateau. Hattusa is central to everything that follows, so hold that name too. It would become one of the most heavily fortified cities of the ancient world, and in the end its burned ruins would become the clue that revealed the whole lost empire to modern eyes. One episode from this early expansion tells us something important about Hittite power at its most aggressive. A Hittite king led an army far to the southeast and struck at Babylon itself, one of the most storied cities in the world, and sacked it. Think about the reach involved. A power from the Anatolian highlands projected force hundreds of miles into the Mesopotamian plain and toppled a legendary city. And yet, and this is the revealing part, the Hittites did not stay. They could raid Babylon, but they could not hold it. The blow effectively ended one Babylonian dynasty and reshaped Mesopotamian history, but the Hittites simply withdrew back to their plateau. This tells us about the shape of Hittite power from the start. It was capable of tremendous strikes, but limited in what it could permanently absorb. Distance was the enemy. Every mile from the highland core stretched the supply lines, the communications, and the loyalty of the men doing the fighting. An army that marched to Babylon and back had crossed brutal terrain and been away from home for a very long time. The Hittite state could reach far, but its grip weakened the farther it reached. This limitation, invisible in the moment of victory, is another of those quiet structural facts that would matter enormously later. After that early burst of expansion came a long, murky period that our sources let us see only in fragments, marked by internal instability. And here we reach one of the chronic diseases of the Hittite system, one that would nearly kill the state more than once before the real end came. The Hittites had a recurring problem with succession. When a king died, the question of who ruled next was not always settled cleanly. Rival princes, powerful queens, ambitious nobles, and members of the extended royal family could all press claims. Assassinations, coups, and bloody family struggles appear repeatedly in the record. One famous early Hittite text, essentially a royal proclamation, laments the murders and betrayals, tearing the royal house apart, and tries to lay down rules for orderly succession. Why does this matter for the collapse centuries later? Because it reveals a permanent structural weakness at the very heart of the machine. An empire is only as stable as its ability to transfer power. Every time a Hittite king died, there was a risk that the whole apparatus would seize up in a fight over the throne, a moment when vassals could rebel, enemies could attack, and the center could lose control. The Hittites developed customs and rules to manage this, and for long stretches they succeeded. But the danger never truly went away. It was baked into the design, a state that has to survive a potential crisis every single time its leader dies is carrying a hidden fragility that no amount of military success can fully cure. Despite these troubles, the kingdom endured, and eventually it entered its greatest age. Under a series of capable rulers, the Hittites transformed from a strong regional kingdom into a genuine empire, one of the recognized great powers of the late Bronze Age. To understand what that meant, you have to understand the world they operated in, because the Hittites did not exist in isolation. They were part of an interconnected club of superpowers, a Bronze Age system unlike anything that had existed before. Picture the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East around 3,300 years ago as a web of great kingdoms in constant contact. There was Egypt to the south, at the height of its imperial power. There was Babylonia and later Assyria in Mesopotamia. There was the kingdom of Mitanni in the north of Syria, and a scatter of other significant states. Across the Aegean stood the Mycenaean Greeks, and on the island of Cyprus and along the Levantine coast sat the great trading cities that moved goods between them all. These powers wrote to one another, and astonishingly, some of that correspondence survives. Kings addressed each other as brother. They exchanged lavish gifts, arranged marriages between royal houses, complained about delayed shipments of gold, and negotiated over borders and refugees. It was, in its way, an early system of international diplomacy, a network of mutual recognition among the strongest players. The Hittites earned their seat at that table, and the thing that let them claim it, more than anything else, was war conducted through a specific and expensive technology, the chariot. The late Bronze Age was the great age of chariot warfare, and the Hittites were among its masters. A war chariot was not a simple cart. It was a precision instrument, a lightweight platform on spoked wheels, drawn by trained horses, carrying men who could rain arrows down on foot soldiers or drive through and shatter enemy formations. But here is what people often miss. A chariot was less a weapon than a system. Building one required skilled woodworkers, leatherworkers, and metalworkers. Fielding one required horses, and horses required breeding, training, feed, and grooms. Fighting from one required a warrior, trained for years, often drawn from a privileged class who could afford the time and equipment. Maintaining a chariot corps meant maintaining a whole infrastructure of specialists, animals, workshops, and supply. This is the hidden layer beneath the glory of Bronze Age armies. Military power in this world was not just about brave men. It was about a state's ability to organize resources, to feed and equip and coordinate a complex, interdependent machine. The Hittites were extraordinarily good at this. They could field large chariot forces, coordinate infantry, absorb and deploy the fighters of their vassals and allies, and project all of it across difficult terrain. Their reputation as a military power rested on this organizational depth. But notice again the double edge. A military built on complex, specialized systems is powerful when everything is functioning, and dangerously brittle when the supporting economy falters. An army of ordinary farmers with spears can regenerate after a bad year. An elite chariot corps that depends on horses, workshops, trained specialists, and steady food cannot be rebuilt overnight. The more sophisticated the machine, the more it has to lose. The clearest window we have into Hittite power at its peak comes from their long confrontation with Egypt over control of Syria. The rich, contested zone between the two empires where their spheres of influence collided. This rivalry produced one of the most famous events in ancient military history, a great clash of chariot armies at a city in Syria, where the Hittite king and the Egyptian pharaoh each led their forces into a battle that both sides, in a sense, claimed to have won. The details of that battle are genuinely fascinating, in part because we have accounts from both sides, a rare gift in ancient history. The Egyptian version, carved triumphantly on temple walls, presents the pharaoh as a near-divine hero who single-handedly turned catastrophe into victory. The reality that historians reconstruct is more complicated. The Egyptian army appears to have been lured forward and ambushed, caught dangerously off guard by a Hittite chariot force, and only through hard fighting and the timely arrival of reinforcements did the Egyptians avoid outright disaster. In strict terms, the battle was closer to a draw. Neither side destroyed the other, neither achieved its full aim. But the aftermath is what truly matters, and it reveals the Hittites at their most impressive. Years after the battle, the two empires did something remarkable. They signed a formal peace treaty, a written agreement between equals, complete with clauses about mutual defense, the return of fugitives, and the recognition of each other's borders and legitimacy. Copies survive from both sides, one in the Egyptian records and one preserved on clay in the Hittite archives. It is the earliest surviving peace treaty between two great states in human history. Think about what that document represents. It means the Hittites were not a barbarian horde on Egypt's frontier. They were a recognized superpower, treated by the mightiest kingdom on earth as a full equal, worthy of a permanent, negotiated peace. This was the summit of Hittite achievement, an empire secure enough, respected enough, and stable enough to lock in its status through diplomacy rather than endless war. At this peak, the Hittite system worked something like this. At the center sat the great king, who was not only a war leader and political ruler, but also the chief religious figure, the human link between the people and the gods. Around him operated a court of officials, scribes, priests, and family members. Beneath and around the core heartlands spread a wide network of subordinate territories. And here we reach the real secret of how the Hittites governed such a large and diverse realm. The Hittites did not try to rule everything directly. They could not. Direct administration of distant, culturally different provinces across such rugged geography would have been impossibly expensive and manpower-heavy. Instead, they built an empire largely out of vassal states. A vassal was a local ruler, often a member of a native dynasty, who kept his throne and governed his own people, but who swore binding loyalty to the Hittite great king. These oaths were formalized in detailed treaties, many of which survive, spelling out exactly what the vassal owed: tribute, troops in wartime, loyalty against the king's enemies, the extradition of fugitives, and the obligation to have no independent foreign policy. In return, the great king offered protection, recognition, and a place within the imperial order. This was a brilliant solution to the problem of scale, and it is one of the most important things to understand about the Hittites. Their empire was not a single solid block. It was a web of relationships, personal bonds of loyalty between the great king and dozens of subordinate rulers, held together by oaths, marriages, threats, rewards, and reputation. When it functioned, it was flexible and efficient. It led a Highland Kingdom project authority across a vast and varied region without the crushing cost of occupying every corner of it. But now look closely, because here lies perhaps the single most important source of Hittite fragility, the flaw that helps explain why the collapse, when it came, was so complete. A web of personal loyalties is only as strong as the loyalties themselves. It depends on the vassals believing that the great king is powerful, that he will protect them, that rebellion is more dangerous than obedience, and that the imperial order will endure. That belief is a kind of currency, and like all currency, it rests on confidence. As long as the king looked strong, the system held. Vassals paid their tribute and sent their troops because they feared the consequences of not doing so and valued the benefits of staying loyal. But confidence can evaporate. If the king appeared weak, if he lost a war, if the center was distracted by a succession crisis, if he could no longer clearly protect his subordinates, then the entire calculation shifted. A vassal watching the center falter would begin to ask a dangerous question. Why keep paying? Why keep sending soldiers? Why stay loyal to a master who can no longer help me and may no longer be able to punish me? The Hittite Empire, in other words, was a structure that depended on the perception of strength. And a structure that depends on perception can unravel with terrifying speed once that perception cracks, because each defection makes the center look weaker, which encourages the next defection in a chain reaction. Keep it in mind, because when we reach the collapse, you will see it operate. There was another pressure on the system that never went away, and it came from the empire's own geography. To the north of the Hittite heartland lay rugged, mountainous country inhabited by peoples, the Hittites, called the Casca. The Casca were not a centralized kingdom the Hittites could defeat once and absorb. They were decentralized, mobile, hard to pin down, and persistently hostile. They raided, they pressed on the frontier. At times they were dangerous enough to threaten the capital region itself, and there are indications that Hattusa was at some points overrun or abandoned under such pressure before being recovered. Managing this northern frontier was a constant, draining commitment, an open wound that never fully healed. It tied down troops and attention that might have been used elsewhere, and it meant the Hittites could rarely feel fully secure in their own core. A great power that must permanently guard its own doorstep against raiders is spending strength simply to stand still. So by its peak, the Hittite Empire was a genuine superpower, but a superpower riddled with structural stresses that were, for the most part, invisible as long as conditions stayed favorable. It rested on rain-fed agriculture that could fail. It carried a chronic succession problem that could paralyze the center. It was held together by a web of vassal loyalties that depended on the perception of strength. It fielded a sophisticated but brittle military machine that needed steady resources, and it faced a permanent drain on its northern frontier. Each of these was manageable on its own in a good year. The terrible question, the one that Bronze Age history would eventually pose to the Hittites and to their neighbors alike, was, what happens if several of these pressures arrive at the same time? Before we follow that question to its end, we have to widen our view, because the fall of the Hittites was not an isolated event. It was part of one of the most dramatic and still debated episodes in all of ancient history, a moment when not just one empire, but an entire interconnected world came apart. To understand why the Hittites broke, you have to understand that they broke together with almost everyone around them in a catastrophe that historians call the Bronze Age Collapse. Around the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 12th century BC, the tightly connected world of Bronze Age superpowers we described earlier, that web of kingdoms writing letters to one another and calling each other brother, suffered a wave of destruction so widespread and so severe that it has few parallels in human history. Within the span of perhaps a few decades, city after city across the eastern Mediterranean was burned or abandoned. Great palaces went up in flames. Whole administrative systems ceased to function. Writing itself disappeared in some regions for centuries. Trade routes that had carried goods across thousands of miles fell silent, and several of the great powers, including the Hittites, effectively ceased to exist. This is the crucial context, and it is why the search for a single killer of the Hittites has always failed. The Hittites did not fall because one clever enemy found their weakness. They fell inside a general collapse that took down the Mycenaean palace civilization of Greece, devastated the great trading cities of the Levantine coast, battered Egypt to the point that it never fully recovered its imperial reach, and reshaped the entire region. The kingdom of the Hittites was one of the largest casualties of an event that broke a whole international order. So the real question is not merely why the Hittites fell, but why an entire interconnected world came apart, and why the Hittites, given their particular structure, were among those least able to survive it. Historians have argued about the causes of the Bronze Age collapse for a very long time. And it is important to be honest here. This remains genuinely debated, and the evidence does not allow a single, clean answer. What has emerged over decades of research, though, is that the old idea of one cause, one invading horde that swept everything away, is almost certainly too simple. The picture that most scholars now favor is a convergence, a situation where several different pressures struck at roughly the same time, and crucially, fed on one another. It was a systems failure, a cascade where each problem made the others worse. Let us walk through the main strands, keeping our Hittite structure in mind, because you will see how each strand pressed on exactly the weak points we identified. Start with the one that connects most directly to the fact I asked you to remember at the very beginning. The rain. There is a growing body of scientific evidence, drawn from things like ancient pollen preserved in sediment, the study of tree rings, and other environmental records, pointing to a period of prolonged drought and climate stress in the eastern Mediterranean around the time of the collapse. This evidence is still being refined, and its exact severity in each region is debated. But the overall pattern is increasingly hard to dismiss. For much of the region, the decades around the collapse appear to have been unusually dry. Now recall the deep vulnerability at the base of the Hittite world. Their food supply rested on rain-fed, farming on a plateau where harvests were unpredictable in the best of times. A great river civilization like Egypt had some buffer against drought, because the Nile flood came from rains far to the south, in another climate system entirely. But the Hittites had no such cushion. Their granaries filled or emptied according to the sky above their own fields. A sustained drought was not an inconvenience for them. It was an existential threat that struck directly at the foundation the entire state was built upon. And we are not merely guessing about this. Among the surviving Hittite and related documents from the final period, there are references that point to serious grain shortages and the urgent need to obtain food. There is correspondence concerning large shipments of grain being sent by sea to the Hittite realm, described in terms suggesting genuine desperation, a matter of life and death. Think about what that means. The great Highland Empire, the equal of Egypt, the master of chariot warfare, was in its last years dependent on grain shipped in from outside to keep its people alive. An empire that cannot feed itself from its own land has lost something more fundamental than any battle. It has lost its independence at the most basic level of survival. Every one of the empire's other strengths, its armies, its vassals, its diplomacy, ultimately rested on the ability to feed people. Pull that foundation away, and everything above it begins to sag. Consider what a prolonged food crisis does to the whole delicate structure we have described. Hungry populations grow restless and may migrate or revolt. A state struggling to feed its core has less to spare for its distant vassals, and less ability to reward loyalty or project the image of unshakable strength. The elite chariot corps, which depended on feeding not only soldiers but horses, becomes harder and harder to maintain, because grain that might feed war horses is desperately needed to feed people. The northern frontier against the Casca becomes harder to hold as resources dwindle. And the succession problem grows more dangerous, because a weakened, hungry state is exactly the kind of environment in which internal rivalries turn vicious and factions fight over a shrinking pie. You can see how a single environmental pressure reaches into every one of the empire's vulnerabilities at once. This is what a system's failure looks like. It is not one blow. It is one pressure that triggers many. But drought was not the only strand, and here we come to the most famous and most misunderstood element of the whole story. The movement of peoples that Egyptian records call the Sea Peoples. The Egyptians left accounts, carved on temple walls, describing coalitions of foreign peoples who came by land and sea, attacking Egypt's coasts and frontiers in this period. The Egyptian texts claim that these peoples had already swept away a series of lands and kingdoms before reaching Egypt, and among the states named as having fallen before them is the land of the Hittites. It is a dramatic image, waves of migrants and raiders in ships and ox carts, women and children among them, moving as if entire populations were on the march, overwhelming the settled powers of the age. For a long time, the Sea Peoples were treated as the simple answer to the whole collapse, a mysterious barbarian invasion that destroyed the Bronze Age world. But modern scholarship treats this with great caution, and you should too. There are real problems with making the Sea Peoples the single cause. For one thing, who they actually were, where exactly they came from, and how organized they truly were, all remain genuinely uncertain and heavily debated. The name itself is a modern label, not something these peoples called themselves. For another, the Egyptian accounts are propaganda, as much as history, designed to glorify the pharaoh's victories, and they compress complicated events into a simple story of heroic defense against foreign chaos. Most importantly, The more we learn, the more it seems likely that the sea peoples were as much a symptom of the collapse as a cause of it. Picture the situation. If drought and famine were driving populations from their homes across the region, if trade was breaking down and cities were failing, then you would expect exactly this. Displaced people on the move. Some in ships, some on land, searching for food and new places to live, sometimes raiding, sometimes migrating, sometimes both. The sea peoples may not have been an external force that arrived from nowhere to destroy a healthy world. They may have been, in part, the people of that world themselves, uprooted by the same crises, turned into refugees and raiders by the collapse of the systems that had once fed and organized them. The distinction matters enormously. It transforms the story from a stable civilization destroyed by invaders into something far more unsettling, a civilization coming apart from within under environmental and economic stress, throwing off its own displaced masses, who then accelerated the destruction of what remained. This brings us to the third great strand, and it is one that speaks directly to the interconnected nature of the Bronze Age world: the collapse of trade. Remember that the late Bronze Age was defined by connection. The great powers were tied together by long-distance exchange, and that exchange was not a luxury. It was a necessity, and this is one of the most important and least obvious points in the whole story. The defining metal of the age was bronze, and bronze is an alloy, made primarily by combining copper with tin. Copper was available in a number of places around the eastern Mediterranean, but tin was rare and had to be brought from far away, along extended trade routes that reached deep into distant lands. This is a stunning fact when you absorb it. The entire military and economic order of the age, the weapons, the tools, the chariot fittings, the very foundation of what we call the Bronze Age, depended on long-distance trade in a scarce metal. Every sword, every spearhead, every armored warrior ultimately depended on tin, arriving from far away over routes that crossed multiple territories and seas. Now imagine what happens to that system under stress. If drought disrupts agriculture, if populations are on the move, if piracy rises as displaced peoples take to the sea, if cities that served as trading hubs are attacked or abandoned, then the long, fragile trade routes begin to break. And once they break, the consequences ripple outward catastrophically. A kingdom cut off from tin cannot easily make bronze. A kingdom that cannot make bronze cannot easily arm its soldiers, or replace its weapons, or maintain its military edge. The interconnection that had made the Bronze Age world so rich and so sophisticated became, in the moment of crisis, a mechanism of shared doom. Each kingdom depended on the others through trade, so when some began to fail, they dragged the rest down with them. The web that had spread wealth now spread collapse. The strength of the system was also, once again, its fragility, the same double edge we have seen at every level of the Hittite world. For the Hittites specifically, dependence on trade was acute. Their heartland could not feed itself reliably, so they needed exchange to bring in grain in hard times. They needed trade for metals and goods. They sat at a crossroads that made commerce central to their power. When the commercial web of the Bronze Age tore apart, the Hittites lost not just luxury and revenue, but the very lifelines they needed to survive a food crisis. The grain that might have saved them had to come by ship along routes that were themselves breaking down under piracy and chaos. An empire desperate for imported food at the exact moment. The trade routes carrying that food were collapsing, was an empire caught in a closing trap. Now, let us bring all these strands together and return to the capital, to Hattusa, and to the actual end. Layer the pressures on top of one another, as the people of the time experienced them, not one after another in tidy sequence, but pressing in together. Drought reduces the harvests, year after difficult year. Granaries run low. The state grows more dependent on imported grain, even as the trade routes that carry it grow more dangerous and unreliable. Hunger spreads. Displaced and desperate people move across the region, some of them raiding, adding to the insecurity that further disrupts trade and farming. The military machine, dependent on steady resources, grows harder to maintain. The northern frontier against the Casca grows harder to hold. And through all of this, the vassal states around the empire's edges are watching. This is where the mechanism, I asked you to remember comes alive. Recall that the Hittite Empire was not a solid block, but a web of loyalties, held together by the perception of the great king's strength. As the center weakened under the weight of famine and disrupted trade, that perception began to crack. Vassals who had once paid tribute and sent troops out of fear and calculation now saw a master who could barely feed his own corps and could no longer reliably protect or reward them. And so the dangerous question spread through the network. Why remain loyal to a center that can no longer help me? As some subordinates pulled away, the center grew weaker still, which encouraged others to pull away in turn. The web did not need to be cut by an outside sword. It could come undone from within, loyalty by loyalty, as the confidence that held it together drained out. The archaeology of the end at Hattusa is revealing, and it is more subtle than the old image of a city stormed and put to the torch by invaders. Excavations suggest that in its final phase, the great capital was, in significant part, deliberately emptied before the end. Valuable items and important records appear to have been removed. The evidence is complex and still studied, but it points less toward a sudden surprise, sacking of a thriving city, and more toward a capital that was being abandoned, its central authority winding down or relocating, its population and treasures drawn away, before destruction came to what was left. In other words, the government may have failed before the city fell. The system may have hollowed out from the inside, the center losing its grip, its people and rulers dispersing, until Hattusa was no longer the beating heart of an empire, but an emptying shell that finally burned. This is a profoundly important distinction, and it captures the essence of what happened to the Hittites. They were not, so far as our evidence suggests, simply overrun by a stronger foe in a single decisive catastrophe. Their state came apart. The complex machine of grain and water, vassals and oaths, chariots and trade, letters and legitimacy, ran out of the things it needed to keep functioning, and it disassembled. The great king's authority evaporated, the vassal web dissolved, the capital emptied, and the thread of continuous royal power that had run for centuries was cut, not by one blade, but by the failure of everything that had sustained it. Now we can answer the question we started with, the strangest one of all. Why did the Hittites, once so mighty, vanish so completely from memory that the world forgot they had ever existed? The answer lies in the completeness of the system's failure. When the Hittite state collapsed, it did not transform into a successor empire that carried its memory forward. Writing in their language ceased. The administrative machine that had produced the clay tablets stopped. The centralized power that had made the Hittites a name to reckon with among the great kings simply ended, and there was no institution left to preserve the story of what had been. What followed across much of the region was a period we sometimes call a dark age, not because nothing happened, but because the systems that generate records, the palaces and their scribes, had failed, leaving us far less to see. Populations survived. Of course, people did not all die. But the world of great palaces and international correspondence and long-distance bronze trade was gone. And with it went the memory of the empire that had been one of its pillars. Smaller successor states in the southeast, in northern Syria, and nearby regions, carried fragments of Hittite culture and traditions forward for some time, and are sometimes called Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite kingdoms. But the great empire of the plateau, the land of Hatti in its full imperial glory, faded into silence. Later peoples in the region knew of Hittites only as a minor local group, a shadow of a name, with no memory that it had once belonged to a superpower that treated with pharaohs as an equal. And so the empire slept, buried and forgotten, for roughly 3,000 years. It was only in the modern era, through the work of archaeologists, and the extraordinary intellectual achievement of decoding the lost Hittite language from clay tablets unearthed at Hattusa, that the world rediscovered them. The very tablets that the empire's scribes had baked and stored, and that fire and time had preserved in the ruins, became the voice of a civilization that had otherwise vanished utterly. There is a quiet irony in this. The writing system the Hittites had borrowed from Mesopotamia. The bureaucratic habit of recording treaties and letters and rituals in clay is the reason we can hear them at all. The empire's memory did not survive in the songs of its neighbors or the monuments of its successors. It survived by accident, hardened in clay, and buried in the ash of its own fallen capital, waiting to be read. So what, in the end, should we take from the fall of the Hittites? It is tempting to look for a villain or a single fatal mistake, but the deeper lesson is harder and more sobering than that. The Hittites were not destroyed by weakness. They were destroyed, in a sense, by the very things that had made them strong. Their empire of vassals and oaths was a brilliant solution to the problem of ruling a vast and difficult region. And it was also a web that could unravel once confidence failed. Their sophisticated chariot armies made them a great power, and also a brittle one that could not easily regenerate. Their position at the crossroads of trade brought them wealth and connection, and also made them dependent on a fragile network that could carry collapse as easily as it carried tin. Their integration into the interconnected Bronze Age world gave them a seat among the great kings, and also chained their fate to the fate of everyone else. Every strength carried its shadow. Every solution contained the seed of a vulnerability. And beneath it all lay that first fact, the one from the plateau where the rain either came or did not. A great civilization had built towering structures of power, diplomacy, and war on top of a food supply that depended on an unpredictable sky. For centuries, the gamble paid off. In good years, the granaries filled. The armies marched, the vassals obeyed, and the letters flowed between brother kings. But the structure had almost no capacity to absorb a sustained shock to its foundation. When the climate turned, when the harvests failed, when the trade routes broke, and the displaced peoples moved, and the vassals lost their faith, all at once, and feeding on one another, there was no reserve deep enough to hold. A system that works beautifully under good conditions and cannot survive bad ones is not as strong as it looks. It is a bet on the weather, and eventually the weather changes. That is why the Hittites still matter, far beyond the specialists who study their tablets. Their story is one of the clearest examples in all of history of how a complex, sophisticated, deeply interconnected society can collapse, not through a single dramatic blow, but through the convergence of pressures that its very sophistication left it unable to withstand. They remind us that connection is both strength and exposure, that specialization is both power and fragility, that the systems which make a society great can be the same systems that make its fall so complete. The most advanced power of its region in its age left the faintest trace precisely because its sophistication had no simple, durable core to survive the loss of the whole. The wind moves now over the ruins of Hattusa, over the great stone gateways and the foundations of temples and the empty places where the granaries once stood. For 3,000 years, no one who passed knew what had happened here, or that the kings who ruled from this high, cold place had once shaped the fate of nations. The empire did not leave us a triumphant memory. It left us a warning, written in clay and buried in ash, about how quickly a world that seems permanent can come apart when the foundations beneath it quietly. And it left us a question that every complex society since has had to answer in its own time, whether it knows the Hittites' name or not. When the good years end and the pressures arrive together, what have we built that is strong enough to endure?